Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for coming this evening to our webinar on digital wellness. We're really excited about this topic. My name is Sarah Castle. I'm the Director of Southborough Youth and Family Services. With me on our panel this evening is also Isabella Caruso, who is the Director of Health and Human Services in Northborough, and Caitlin Titches, who is our presenter this evening, who I will share some more information about in just a minute. This is a webinar that's put on in partnership between Northborough Health and Human Services and Southborough Youth and Family Services. And we're excited about this topic, but it's also timely. It's an important topic all year round, but we're heading into summer. Parents are eager to learn about this topic, and it's also Mental Health Awareness Month. So it's a great time to be providing this. I'm going to pass the baton over to Isabella to talk a little bit about Health and Human Services. Isabella.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us. I know we're all very busy on a Wednesday evening. At least it's rainy and cold, so we don't want to be outside. But as Sarah said, I'm the Director of Health and Human Services over in Northborough, and we do a range of things similar to Sarah in Southborough, doing application assistance, resource management, as well as short-term counseling. But the whole gamut to septic inspections and food safety. So you name it, we probably do it. So we're happy to help you. We have our website, phone number, email, anything. We are here to help for Northborough residents. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. And in Southborough, we are a little bit different. We are not a combination department with the health department. However, many of the things that Isabella mentioned, mental health support for residents, social services, and then programs like this, which fall under prevention programs, which are open to the public from any community. So welcome to Southborough and Northborough residents, and those of you who are joining us from other communities. We're happy to have all of you. So our plan for tonight is to be together until 8 p.m. I'm going to pass the baton over to Caitlin shortly. She's going to present for just under an hour on some great information. Many of you who registered for this webinar sent in questions in advance. So Caitlin's had a chance to review those, and the questions that won't be covered in her presentation, she's hung on to until the end. And as we're going along, we're going to ask that if you have any comments or questions that you want to, new questions, to put them in the Q&A. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we will then transition over to answering questions, and we'll have a good chunk of time to do that. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and introduce Caitlin. So Caitlin Titches is the medical librarian and knowledge manager for the Digital Wellness Lab at Boston Children's Hospital. In her role, she supports both the research and outreach of the lab. She is the author of research briefs focused on summarizing scientific research into accessible reads, reporting on topical issues like social media and body image, and has also been invited to speak at conferences for a wide variety of audiences to support outreach efforts to empower parents, teachers, and community leaders to support youth digital wellness. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin.
Oh, perfect. I was muted. All right, let me share my slides here. Let me switch the screen. Okay, perfect. I think this is just my slides, correct, Sarah?
That is correct. It's just your slide.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to be speaking to you today, especially about this topic. It's something that I love talking about and have spoken about in the past, especially last year, kind of the twist into the summer. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a digitally saturated world supporting your child's positive media use this summer and beyond. So thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Caitlin Titches. Like I mentioned, I am the medical librarian and knowledge manager. I have a very unique job. I'm very lucky. So when you think librarian, I am a little bit outside of that scope. And so I am really in charge of making sure that the Digital Wellness Lab is staying as up to date as possible on the research that is coming out in this field. As you can imagine, there is a lot of it, and making sure that the projects that we're undertaking and the information that we're giving parents and teachers and teenagers themselves is as rooted in evidence as possible. I am happy to take any questions, or if you think of something later, please reach out to me on either LinkedIn or my email, and I would love to chat. So just an overview of the topics that I'll be covering today. So we're going to dive a little bit just into the technology, media, and brain development sphere, just to give a little bit of a kind of background on why this matters. Kids are growing up in a very different world than most of us did. It looks very different than 10 years ago, which I like to think I was in high school 10 years ago, but I was in college 10 years ago. It feels like time is irrelevant now, but it looks very different than the social media platforms that I was on or the television that I was watching. So how is that affecting their day-to-day lives, starting with technology kind of from the get-go? Then in terms of summer, we're going to look at screen time versus green time and how we can kind of integrate the two and really make sure that we're focusing on those in-person experiences over the summer. We'll talk a little bit about mediation strategies. So now that we know the benefits and the risks, what can we do to kind of make sure that our children are using media in healthy and supportive ways? And then lastly, we'll look at some tools. So what tools are there to help mediate or have parental controls, and how do we find them? So we'll go through a couple examples of where to find some of these parental controls and what they mean. But to get started, we'll jump into technology, media, and brain development. And I actually have a question for you all. You can either scan the code or go to slido.com to add some if you would like. I'll leave it open for a minute. Is when you think about kids and media, what words come to mind? So I am in this sphere all the time. And so I'm kind of thinking about it from someone who has the opportunity to look at this and think about, all the nuance and all the things that are happening from both a science viewpoint and a teaching viewpoint. But I want to know, what are your concerns, or what do you think about when you think about kids and media? So I'll give you a minute for that. And it'll help me kind of make sure that I'm really answering all of your questions and concerns in this. Amazing. Okay. Don't see any. Oh, one more person type in. Let me check. Okay. As a few more things are coming in, I'm just going to, I'm noticing that there's a lot of concern about distraction and just unable to kind of get away from the media, but also an acknowledgement that it's really important to kids now. So it's like some of their friendships are built on there, or developed further. They have a friend in school, but they also play video games with them, or that it's necessary, that it's an important piece of our landscape. We are doing this online. We are, I made my presentation using a tool that helps me link to all of you. But there are a lot of concerns about distraction and anxiety and how it's really affecting mental health. So let's go all the way back to the youngest kids and see what it looks like when we start using technology. So even though there are some recommendations from places like the American Academy of Pediatrics about screen time, we know that young children are regularly exposed to digital content for a variety of different reasons, right? So the American Academy of Pediatrics really recommends that children avoid screen time besides things like connecting with family, like FaceTime or video chats of that manner, before 18 months old. But we live in a world that's super digitally connected, so that's not always possible or feasible. Sometimes you're on a very long flight with a toddler, and the iPad can be helpful in those scenarios. So some of those reasons can be really beneficial, right? Like I mentioned, FaceTiming with faraway family members. It might not seem like it's providing a whole lot of benefits to the child, but it's a really great bonding experience for the family. And it does kind of help build that social connection. So it's a really great way to introduce a young child or have them listen to grandma read a bedtime story and just form that kind of fundamental bond in an example of sometimes you might not be able to see them all the time in real life. But some of the less positive effects come into play when we think about learning. So there's a lot of claims about and from television shows, YouTube channels, and apps on iPads that claim to support early education. But the research landscape kind of tells a different story. So infants and young toddlers before the age of around 2.5, 3 have a really difficult time translating what they learn on a screen to real life. So, for example, a very famous research project was multiple tests to see if young children could find objects if they saw someone hiding it physically or watch someone hide it on a television screen. And they had a much harder time when they were younger finding it when they saw the researcher hide it on a screen. So we call this like the video deficit. So it's the things that you're learning on a screen don't necessarily translate really well in real life when you're that young, and you have to learn these kind of fine motor skills and social skills in real life. So the other thing is that, I mentioned games and videos online. There's not a lot of regulation as to kind of how you earn an educational stamp. So some of these apps have really minimal benefits, especially when they're used alone. A 2-year-old might be able to trace the letter A and, count to 10, but they're not necessarily really understanding the concepts because it's packaged within this very flashy, very exciting game that's what's drawing their attention, not the educational aspect. Versus things like we think about the shows that maybe some of us grew up with, like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or still existing Sesame Street. Those are really rooted in research about how can we make a slow-paced, nice, comfortable experience for young children that is engaging but still is at a pace that they can understand and learn some of these social cues or early learning opportunities. So encouraging your child while you're watching these television shows can help bridge that gap, right? If Elmo's answering some questions about their feelings, your child might not understand how that translates to real life, but you can start that conversation and say, wow, Elmo's talking about how he's really sad today. Yesterday, I was feeling kind of sad. Have you ever felt sad? So it's bridging that gap, right? Without that help from you, it can be really hard to bridge that. But when you have that, it can help build those connections. Then when they start school and they're starting preschool, we can still work on these kind of good quality educational media. Now it can help support learning. Once they're 3 and older, they recognize, things that are real or not real on the television screen, and they can help build those skills. Like I said, apps might be marketed as educational, but have no input from specialists or educators because there's no approval board. So as your child gains access to things like an iPad or apps on your phone, it's really important to kind of test those out yourself beforehand and see, first of all, are there ads that are kind of breaking in every 5 minutes as you play this game? So it's really important to make sure that you have that structure that's going to keep children engaged but focused instead of kind of a million distracting things, because that's where that executive functioning plays a role, right? We need to learn how to regulate ourselves and how to focus on a task, and we start doing that during those preschool years. And if all of the media that we're consuming is just trying to get us to make a lot of different decisions, we're not really able to practice those skills. And we can see that again, and when some of those concerns that you brought up were like the addiction or the feeling like they just can't disconnect. We see this really early. It's not just social media. It's 93% of parents who say that their child at least sometimes resists moving away from screens. So when the media that is being consumed is so engaging, it's hard. Why would we want to move away, right? We probably do this on our social media. If we're scrolling and just every video is just something that we really want to learn about or just really enjoy, it's all about our favorite show that we've been watching. We have a hard time disengaging from that too. So we can't expect, very young children to have these skills to be able to do that either. So one thing that we can do is really have routines that are built into the media. So when media is used in the day or what it's specifically used for can be helpful. So, sometimes the tech itself can act as a support. So instead of taking away the tablet after 20 minutes of YouTube, if we have autoplay turned off by default on YouTube, there's a little bit more of kind of a speed bump and a separation. So now that there's a natural end point after the video is done, instead of immediately jumping into the next one. So feeling like there's kind of never a stopping point. Then when we get to elementary school, a lot of kids get their own devices. They're using devices in school for educationally centered tasks for the first time, or they're playing more interactive games. So with this new exploration and independence comes the chance of exposure to and processing of things like body ideals, for instance. Girls especially report, even at very young ages, like comparing themselves to thin girls that are commonly shown on the media. So we really want to make sure that we're having these conversations early. We think about social media and body image and making sure that teenage girls in particular are not being, shown these very thin ideals or dieting habits very on their social media pages, but we need to have these conversations before they're exposed to that, because traditional media can expose them to these as well. There is a lot of this even in just commercials that play on YouTube or on a television. When they're watching a show, they're getting inundated with these messages. So if we can have these conversations at 8 or 9, by the time that they enter these social media spaces, they have a little bit more knowledge and media literacy to tackle these difficult content that they might see. And the other form of media that's really popular at this age is video games. And a lot of research really has honed in on how video games are a social space, especially now after COVID. Video games have become a place to hang out. So for teenagers, they're spending time on video games instead of, or in addition to, hanging out with their friends at the park. They're video chatting with each other while they play, they're voice chatting. These are really kind of hangout spaces. And if we want to have children spend more time in the real world, which I think we all really want to encourage, especially in the summer, that kind of spending time outside, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we need to cultivate more spaces for especially teenagers to hang out by themselves. Or by themselves, I mean without parents or without adults around. There's been a lot of movement of, teenagers not being able to spend time at the mall or not be alone at parks. And so they go online because they want to hang out and they want to spend time with each other. And that's where they can feel like they can be themselves and just be silly and be teenagers. So when we're thinking about this and, really trying to mitigate some of these effects, I really encourage us all to think about, where are we making space for kids and teenagers in these real world spaces? And the last big milestone that we see before adolescence is getting that first phone. So our research shows that the average child is receiving their first phone, and by that we mean smartphone, around age 10. So some children, when they get their smartphones, they are not supposed to be on social media, right? We all know that the age to sign up is 13, but we can get around that. And again, we have to assume that children are being exposed to these platforms. When we think about social media regulations, we can help our child set up their own accounts when they're 13, but that doesn't mean that their friend hasn't shown them a Snapchat or things like that. So proactively having these discussions on how to recognize something that's not real, or making sure that we're not adding people as friends that we don't know in real life, are really important. And we know this because research shows that using these platforms like Snapchat and Instagram on your own before you're 11 is related to more problematic digital behaviors in the future, like being the victim of harassment. So it's really important to make sure that when children are getting their phone, they are not setting them up. It can be really tempting to think that your child understands this technology more than you, and they might, but make sure that you are setting it up with them. So you can talk through some of these parental controls that you're setting, or the rules and expectations that you have as a family. When we think about the phone, that's kind of something that makes a lot of parents nervous, is how to set it up. So it's a lot easier to add new features as you feel your child is ready for them than taking them away. And I know that was actually one of the questions, is how do we kind of roll back some of these media habits that have become common in families. And we'll talk about that later, but if you can, it's a lot easier to kind of set the most strict regulations and kind of build as you feel like your child is using this material in an appropriate way, then take it away. And you can have those conversations with them and saying, hey, I really want to make sure, this can be a distraction. I'm sometimes distracted by my phone. So we're going to set your screen time limit for an hour right now. And maybe, next year we can look at it again. If you keep up those awesome grades and you're still spending time with your friends on playing baseball. But right now, I think this is the limit that we need to set to make sure that you're using this in a healthy way. And then that adolescent step is where social media becomes really important. Kids are using social media all the time, and most of them have started using it very young, because we're including YouTube as social media. And so YouTube right now is still the most popular platform of social media for teenagers. Almost all teenagers are using it in some way. Not only for entertainment, they're also using it to learn things or to help with their homework, but most teenagers use this almost every day. And so we know that that's where they're spending time. That's where they're learning. That's where they're kind of integrating all of their interests. One of the most popular things to do on YouTube, especially for kind of that middle school boy age, is watching videos about video games. So kind of integrating all of your interests together. The good news is that teenagers are really learning how to navigate these spaces in ways that protect themselves. So most teenagers never or almost never feel anxious after being online or when they couldn't go online. So we see a lot of concern about social media and mental health, and there are definitely risk factors that we need to look out for. But for most teenagers, they're saying that social media, some days it might be not so great on their mental health. Other days it might really help them connect with someone if they're having a hard time. But most days it's just kind of neither. It's kind of neutral. And I think a really interesting way to explore this and how we talk about social media really shapes their experiences is a new poll just came out where about half of teenagers say that social media is bad for other people their age, but only about 15% said it's bad for them. So that's really interesting to me because it means that individual teenagers aren't necessarily having a bad time at social media, but our messaging about it is kind of filled with a lot of fear and anxiety. So it can drive them to be a little bit more cautious, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we just need to make sure that we're kind of talking to them instead of just a blanket ban, because they're going to find a way on these apps because they feel like they're helpful for them. So if we just remove all of their access, it becomes a forbidden fruit. And why is social media so appealing to teenagers? Well, part of the reason is that because during adolescence, finding your identity becomes a key developmental task. I think we can all remember being an awkward teenager and not being sure about what you liked and who you liked and what your interests were, and maybe even trying on some different hats, right? Maybe you really enjoyed, I'm going to use my own experience here. I was definitely kind of a little bit more sporty when I started high school, but that wasn't really me. I was kind of doing that to fit in. By the time I graduated, I was a theater kid and I loved it. And I found my identity there. It didn't mean that the other things that I explored weren't me, but it just was me trying to figure out what my core identity was. So social media is an awesome place to explore this. So that is a place where teenagers can find social support. And this is really important if that is missing in person. So if a teenager feels like some of the people in their school don't really have interests that align with theirs, or they really like something that isn't cool. Well, there's thousands of teenagers online that think that same thing is really cool. And that can be really validating and helping you find your confidence and build a community. But on the flip side, teenagers are very, very aware of what other people think of them. Again, when you were an awkward teenager, when I was an awkward teenager, I just remember really feeling like everyone was just watching everything that I did. And that is really amplified on social media, right? We see those friendship pressures and social comparison, comparing ourselves to, influencers or people that we feel like just have a better life than us or have their life all wrapped up together. And when you're a teenager and you're not quite sure who you are or, where you're going, that can add a lot of pressure to yourself to succeed because you're seeing a snapshot of someone's life, not necessarily the, reality of their entire experience. So for most teenagers and younger, media use isn't necessarily problematic, right? We might want to tone it down a little bit or make sure that we're prioritizing those other real life experiences with other people. But sometimes use can become problematic. And that's when, instead of saying, after 2 hours, wow, that's way too much, we think about it in terms of when it starts affecting other parts of a teenager's life. So Are they sleeping less? Are they not spending as much time with their friends? Are they kind of becoming more socially isolated? Those are are their grades slipping? Those are the indicators that we look for in terms of when use becomes problematic. And interestingly, there is a clinic for interactive media and internet disorders, which one of our wonderful founders started, Michael Rich. And in the time in the clinic, he always discusses how patients almost always have an underlying condition or concern. So the problematic use isn't necessarily the driver of the issue. So for young people, oftentimes this can be things like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, or even a large change in their life, like moving or family changes. So the media isn't necessarily driving the issue, but it's the symptom of a larger concern. And the media is now being used to meet some unsatisfied need, whether it's social or emotional. So when we think about, for example, a young person with autism, social interactions can be really tough. It can feel really difficult to make sure that you're making eye contact all the time, or you're saying the right thing, or you're not talking too much about something that you like. So these digital spaces can feel like a safe place to kind of practice those situations. When we think about, depression or family changes, if somebody has moved or they have a parent that divorces, think about starting a new school and you don't know anybody and all your friends are back at your other school. You might turn to your phone more to make sure that you're staying in contact and making sure that you're still talking to them and staying up to date on all the drama at your old school. That's not necessarily like a healthy habit, right? We want to make sure that we're staying in touch with our old friends, but maybe that's stopping us from making new friends at our new school. So oftentimes, when the underlying concern is treated, the problematic media use really gets mitigated or even goes away, right? If we start kind of acknowledging the larger issue, some of those problematic behaviors that they're using to meet an emotional need are going to go away. Now, I know that was a lengthy primer on general effects. Thank you for bearing with me there. But what are some things that we're particularly concerned about over the summer, like media interfering with time spent outside in nature, in the hopefully sunlight? I know it's a little bit hard to think about that right now when it's so chilly and dreary again, but it will get there. So first, we acknowledge that media can be a contentious subject. During COVID, half of parents said there were disagreements about media use a few times a week or more. And so we can kind of extrapolate this to summer times as well. When we're spending more time together, there's not as much structure in our day. You're not going to school. You might be, as parents, working from home or going to the office, and there's different things that you have to kind of juggle than during the school year. So some of these media habits are likely going to be impacted from that. The most common reason for disagreements was, of course, the time spent on media. So parents are telling us that they're overwhelmed with balancing the harms and benefits of technology for their children. What are some actionable ways to kind of mitigate these disagreements, especially in the summer? We'll start by discussing how we can do screen time versus green time and what the mindset can be here. So screen time is a normal part of children's days in this digital age, but it can displace some of these healthy choices like exercise, physical play, or impede making healthy food choices, right? If we're just sitting in front of the television, we might snack a little bit more than if we were really thinking about the food that we were eating. Versus green time, which is spending time outside in nature, which we know can decrease stress, encourage healthy risk-taking play, like playing on a playground and maybe trying the monkey bars for the first time. And it can also support positive mental health. Now, it's important to acknowledge that when we think about screen time, instead of thinking about it as a set of limits that fit into every day the same exact way, we should think about it in terms as like a cup that we need to fill up with everything else, and then what's left over for screen time. So instead of saying you can play video games 1 hour every day, well, I'm going to be pretty tempted as a child to get that hour of video gaming in and then wish that I had more time. And I'm not saying that that's not ever going to happen. It definitely will, right? There are going to be scenarios where you just want one more level or you just want to keep playing. But if we switch it, we can think about, okay, what are all of the other things we have to do? We definitely want to make sure we get enough sleep. We are going to have our dinners together, and we're going to have a no devices zone when we're eating together. We really want to watch this show that we're all watching together. So we need to fit that into our day. And that's, our family spend time. And what are your summer camps looking like this year? Okay, you're probably spending about 4 hours a day on the weekdays there. So that's not time that we're spending on media. All right, we need to make sure that you're spending time with friends too. Let's add, some time on Tuesdays and Thursdays that we know your friends are free. And so then you've filled up the cup with all these other spaces before you're thinking about the screen time, instead of kind of trying to fit the screen time in wherever. It will feel a little bit more natural of, okay, I have all of these other things I want to do. Now I can fit screen time in, instead of really hyper focusing on the screen time and trying to fit everything else around that. Now, the other thing you can do to help make both work this summer is consider using technology to facilitate learning, to engage with nature. So I'm thinking an app like AllTrails. So have your child look for something and discover somewhere new near you, like a day hike, and look up pictures and point out features, help them make you the directions or a trail map. So this trail says it's easy. We're looking at the pictures. Do you think that it matches that label? Maybe we should check it out. So you use technology to leverage a learning opportunity for how to plan for an outdoor adventure. You can use a streaming service to watch a documentary about a specific place or habitat or animal, and then do an activity related to what you learn. Libraries are really great opportunities for this. They, have a lot of activities during the summer, and you could learn about an activity that they're doing. Maybe they're doing a zoo craft experience. And so then you could watch a documentary about your favorite zoo, or watch a YouTube video of someone going to your favorite zoo, and then go to that activity. So you're kind of building off of something that your child is interested in, and leveraging that media for an entertaining purpose, and linking it to kind of an educational and social experience. And then lastly, you could download an app that kind of has to be used in nature. So there's a lot of apps that recognize bird calls or identify plants by taking a picture of them. You have to be outside to use those. So, you still have your phone. Most of us are carrying our phone wherever we're going, but we have to be out in nature to use this app. And bonus, now you're learning about birds, you're learning about different plants. So since this technology is all around us, instead of kind of siloing it off as only in an entertainment space and then nature, think about, it's important to have time where we're completely disconnected from our devices, but since it's there, how can we kind of integrate it into our day-to-day lives in a way that encourages us to spend more time in nature? So now we're going to move into the protection and literacy piece. So thinking about how we can make rules and how we can encourage children to think about what they're seeing online. So I have another question here, and that is that what kinds of rules around media do you currently have in your household right now? Okay, so no screens in bedroom, no phones at dinner, so spaces where we shouldn't be using our devices. Screen time limits. Types of screen content, screens off, yep. Putting screens in different rooms. Oop, go too far. Using games together. Perfect. Okay. This is awesome. So I'm seeing both rules in terms of like screen time limits and also where we can be using media and who we're using it with. So I really want to highlight, I'm not sure it's going to let me pull it here, but there were two that I thought were really interesting in terms of where we are allowed or not allowed to use screens. And I think they're really important for different reasons that are both really developmentally important for adolescents and younger children. So there was a rule about no screens in bedrooms. Sleep is so important for children, and sleep is one of the things that is really, really linked with media use. Again, this is something I think we can all relate to, right? You're tossing and turning, you're thinking about something, and you're like, I just need to look that up on my phone. Teenagers feel these same stresses, but they also feel that kind of FOMO, right? That need to feel connected and stay in touch with friends all the time. And so we really encourage phones to be out of these spaces where we're sleeping, or at least somewhere, you know, away from your bedside, right? Maybe you use your phone as an alarm. Well, it should be on the other side of your room because you're just adding that little speed bump of access, right? If it's right next to me, I can roll over and grab it. And maybe I need to check one thing, but now I'm checking TikTok too. Whereas if it's on the other side of the room, there's a little bit more of a barrier for me to have access to it, right? I need to get up, I need to walk to the other side of the room. I'm already cozy in my bed. Maybe I'm going to do it a little bit less. So, you know, I think taking screens out of bedrooms is the ideal scenario, but at least adding a little bit of a speed bump there wherever possible. The other thing was that there were no screens during dinner or during meals. That is also so important because that's the opportunity for teenagers, especially, to have conversations with you. And that might mean that they're talking to you about what they saw on TikTok that day, or this really cool YouTube video that their friend showed them. But it allows them to kind of have those daily conversations with you and check in without the screens. And I think we have those rules for, you know, children, but that also we need to be following that as well, right? Especially for teenagers, there's nothing more hypocritical, or there's nothing more annoying than being told one thing and then seeing everyone else do another thing. So if you say you're not allowed to use your phone when you're having dinner, but you're checking your work emails at dinner, you know, that can seem really hypocritical to a young person. So thinking about how can I also model these behaviors? So all of these together kind of fit into 3 different mediation strategies, and they overlap, and some people, you know, find more support with one or another, but we can think about 3 buckets of these kind of rules and expectations that we can have and how we mediate media in our homes. So the first one is active mediation, and that means that we're discussing the content of digital media encountered before or during. So this is really, really helpful, and that it can kind of get kids thinking about what they're seeing, right? And this can mean when you're setting up social media accounts with your child, saying your experiences as well. So talking about your experiences on social media and saying, yeah, you know what, when we're setting this up, let's block these different content filters, because sometimes I get videos about, people going to the beach, but it seems like they're really kind of only talking about their body, and that makes me really uncomfortable. So I don't want to see that. I definitely think that that's not really appropriate for you to be seeing. Let's make sure that, such and such hashtags are blocked on your social media accounts. And so you're explaining the rationale behind your restriction decisions. It doesn't mean that you can't have rules about, when and how media can be used, but you're just explaining those so that, you're giving a little bit of a reason and encouraging kids to think about, how they can use media in healthy ways. Very similar to active is co-viewing. And so this is sharing the watching or playing without necessarily actively engaging in discussion about the content of what's being seen. This is really common in video gaming. And we really, really encourage parents, if your child is interested in video games, play with them, even just for 10 or 15 minutes. It shows both that you're interested and curious about something that they love, but also it helps you learn about what's so appealing about it. You're probably, unless you're a gamer yourself, you're probably going to be really bad at the game, or maybe you're just watching them playing and asking questions. But it just really shows that you're paying attention in a way that's not necessarily immediately punitive, right? You want to know why they love this so that you can understand it. And then the last is restrictive, and that's rulemaking with little to no input from children on what can't be watched or when devices can't be used. And while this is important to have restrictions, this is most effective for younger children. And the little input from children is the most important piece here, because for younger children, they don't necessarily have these regulation skills or even motor skills to kind of use the devices on their own. So they need a little bit more restriction. But as children get older, if they have restrictive rules with no input or no understanding of how this is affecting them, it becomes that forbidden fruit. And so we see that it's really important to think about how we can include our children in these discussions as they get older in a developmentally appropriate way, so that it doesn't become this kind of forbidden item that they just want to do even though they know they shouldn't, or are now keeping any information away from you because they feel like you might take it away. Some really interesting research shows that for cyberbullying, or even for some really concerning behaviors like harassment online, or we see now like the AI deep fakes of people. If a child is concerned that the first thing that's going to happen is their phone is going to be taken away, or they're going to get in trouble, or their time online is going to get restricted, they are less likely to tell an adult that something was happening to them. Versus if you're making rules, but you're setting expectations and understandings about why this is happening, they're more likely to come to you in a time of need and share what's happening so that you can fix it together. And so this can really help protect kids from, something escalating out of control. Kids, they might encounter something that makes them uncomfortable, but if instead of telling you about it, they hide it, and now their algorithm is just showing more and more of that, and they don't know how to break out of it, that's a lot more damaging than saying, hey, mom, I saw this online. It made me really uncomfortable. I didn't mean to. How can we make sure I don't see it again? So having those conversations is absolutely crucial. Now, my last question here is about parental controls and how we can kind of set up these kind of parameters, with or without a child being involved. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all to 5 being very knowledgeable, how comfortable or confident are you about accessing and using parental controls on the apps and games that your children use the most? Okay, not super confident, not completely lost, but very overwhelmed, kind of in the middle. All right, so we're kind of, all right, we're split, but nobody feels super confident. And that is really this is really common. So it can feel like these spaces are really hard to find, or there's just so overwhelming. So I am going to kind of walk through some ideas on how to start these conversations with your child and set up these regulations. And we will walk through the pages on Roblox and TikTok, but also just kind of give some general information at first as well. So again, it can feel really overwhelming to access these parental controls on new applications. But whenever possible, take time to familiarize yourself with them before your child starts using that platform. Again, it's a lot easier to add new features than take them away because they've already been accessing them. Another good thing is that many popular platforms with children have completely separate and so more limited options or parental control guides. So a lot of kids are using YouTube, but there is a YouTube Kids. So we should make sure that whenever possible, we're only accessing that. But there are other ones that less people know about as well. So thinking about Spotify. Listening to music is an awesome opportunity. Kids love to dance and to play with their friends and, you know, make silly dances with each other. But even if we kind of make a playlist on our own Spotify, one wrong click can kind of lead to some other music that we might necessarily not want them listening to. So Spotify Kids kind of removes that larger space that they could end up in. And when we think about parental controls, I know it can feel very, very daunting to find them. Most places do have guides that really walk you through each step of the process. So just doing a quick Google search about parental controls and app, go to the actual platforms page. So there might be a YouTube video about how to do this, but it's a good place to start at the platform itself. So I looked up, you know, YouTube Kids and parental controls and insert app, and their page popped up right away. So I'm actually going to share now a different screen to look at the Roblox, for example. Okay, so if I search Roblox and parental controls, I am brought, like, the first option on Google is to get to this page. So I can see that there are ways to block experiences, to add content labels. And of course, I don't have time to like go through everything now, but it's just showing you that there are step-by-step guides to get to some of this material that in the platform itself can seem kind of daunting. And something that I see time and time again on here, and then also on TikTok, where I will show as well, is the option to link a child account. That is a really, really awesome way to have this opportunity to add and remove new features. So if you create an account, right, you maybe want to test out Roblox yourself. Now, when your child gets an account, you can link their account and you can see how much time they're spending on the app, what experiences are blocked, if they try and get around some of those features that you have put in. And so it adds, again, it adds a buffer. Instead of saying, okay, you only get 1 hour, but now just something pops up and they can click right out of it. If it's linked to your account, when that 1 hour time limit pops up, it's a lot harder to navigate around because it's linked to your account instead of them just being able to swipe that away. So, you know, things like content labels, communication controls to make sure that they're only talking to people that they can chat with others within a certain, you know, parameters that you are setting. And again, go through this. If they are of an age where it's appropriate, you can go through these with your child and saying, hey, this is the communication controls. here's why I'm setting it here now, but you can see that there are other levels. So, in 6 months, let's see if what your experiences are. And maybe they say, I can never talk to my friends because the chat is just blocking everything. Well, maybe you can add a little bit more of, of a less of a buffer there, but you're starting with a little bit of a lower opportunity for higher access so they can earn it instead of, just locking it down and saying, that's it, we're never going to discuss it again. Now, the other thing is, again, so we have TikTok, so you can family pair on TikTok as well. So you can customize safety settings like screen time. And again, I have a screen time on my TikTok, but it's linked to my own account. So if I just pop in a code that I know, I can bypass that. If it was linked to a different account, I can't bypass that. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. You can set screen time. And what's really interesting is, and I think a great conversation starter is that you can see, it might actually not be on, nope, okay. So you can see a summary of how much time they're spending every day and how many times they're opening up the app over the past 4 weeks or month. So you can have these conversations of, hey, I see that you're spending an hour every day, and I can see that you're kind of picking it up a lot when you're supposed to be doing homework. Maybe that means that we need to be putting our phone in a different room when we're doing homework because it's a distraction. And I can see, exactly what's happening instead of just kind of, an insult. This is a reason why we need to make these decisions. And the last thing that I think is really important now is with all this conversation about algorithms and how they affect us. One of the really interesting features, again, and this was in the parental monitoring section that I actually myself didn't know about until recently, is that you can completely reset your feed. So if you are getting a lot of videos that are making you uncomfortable, or you're just not really sure how you got there, or if you're a teenager and you used to be really interested in something and now you're not, there is a way to refresh your TikTok feed and bring it back, like just wipe it and give you a whole new slate to, learn new videos that you like. So this is an opportunity to say, hey, if we start seeing videos that we don't like, here's how to block it. Here's how to, report something that's really uncomfortable. But here's also just how to kind of give yourself a fresh slate to start over. So these are just some of the guides that are available. Again, these are from the pages of the platforms themselves. And so YouTube videos can be helpful if you're not sure of how to get to some of these or what they look like in practice. But as a starting point, this is an absolutely awesome place to go, is just a Google search of whatever platform you're using and parental controls. Now let me get back to my PowerPoint. And we have, I think, one more slide. All right, so just as a final review, some of the important things that we chatted about today is that for starters, summer is a great time to instill this healthy balance between the digital and natural to ensure that screen time is not replacing physical activity and outdoor play, but can enhance it or can be fit into a busy life in a developmentally appropriate and helpful way. Household rules about media use can and should evolve as your child grows. So restrictive media use might be great for a younger child who's just learning how to use something, but these conversations should definitely be occurring as children are getting their own device, whether it be a smartwatch or a smartphone, or just checking in and making sure that the rules that are in play are still effective and that you're having those open conversations. extended time in front of screens, especially when alone, can have negative effects on learning and social emotional development. So limiting screen use for younger children to co-use opportunities whenever possible is great. And you can do that for teenagers as well. And maybe make a video with them or do a recipe that they found online. So that's kind of how co-use can evolve as children get older. And thinking about and acknowledging why this is so important to them. They love to hang out with their friends on this video game, and then they talk about it in school. Or they really love this show that nobody else seems to like at school, so that's why they're watching videos about it on YouTube. Staying curious and instilling that protective media literacy, critical thinking skills can happen at the same time, and that will help us protect our children. So that is all I have in terms of presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I know I'm chatting for a while, so now I know there are some questions that I saw in the Q&A, but also that there were some other questions coming through.
Of course, thank you so much. I think that was a really insightful presentation on a topic that is ever evolving. So thank you so much, Caitlin. So feel free, attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A. We will read those off as well. But to start with some questions that were in the registration. You talked a little bit about this, but how do you walk back tech decisions with children after changing, their mind? So maybe there are some parents here on the webinar who are thinking, oh no, maybe I should change what I had originally said. How do you kind of walk that back and balance that line?
I think that's one of those conversations where I think it should be done with, like, you can set that boundary, but don't do it in secret. So don't kind of like set the parental control and then they only notice it when they're on that app again. Having that conversation and saying, giving the reason, like, why is this being walked back? And maybe allow for the opportunity to earn it back if, grades are increasing or they're starting a new sport and they're, kind of giving it their all and they just need something to relax with after, and maybe that application that they were using fits it in. But some of that, like, really big argument piece can come in when it's a surprise or it feels like they were not, their opinions were not taken into account at all. And so kind of there might be friction. We can't completely ignore that or avoid that, but acknowledging, like, hey, this is why I'm doing this. This is a rule. This is here, but I'm telling you before it happens.
Great, thank you. And we actually just got a question in the chat, so we'll skip to that one. Towns these days do not have safe spaces for teens to hang out and spend time face to face with their friends. What are some ways we can help teens to make sure they go out and hang out outside with their friends?
Yeah, I think this is a really big problem. I think that this is, one of the things that does drive teenagers online, and it's something that we hear is that's why they're spending time on video games. It's just because they don't really feel, oftentimes, safety is an issue, but also they don't really feel welcome in these spaces, like you might go to the park and somebody's yelling at you that you shouldn't be on the swings or something like that. There's a lot of kind of like surveillance of these spaces that used to feel like teen spaces. So the first thing that I would do is, whenever possible, kind of create a community coalition, see if talk to the library. Libraries are spaces that runs lots and lots of like teen events and things like that are a little bit more like teen run and kind of hands off from librarians. So talk to libraries if there's like a YMCA or something to create spaces, and also kind of market to teenagers, kind of have, whether it's a youth advisory board who's on, the library or the YMCA or whatever space you're trying to make safe and welcoming to teenagers, or kind of getting your own kids on board and they can tell people about it, to have events that welcome teenagers into these spaces, give them a place where they can kind of let loose and like feel comfortable. And that once that initial contact happens, they're more likely to come back when they feel that it's a space where they can spend time, instead of, going somewhere feeling like people don't really want them there. That's just going to continue to drive them online. But community coalition is definitely the biggest one, and talking to like your kids and other people, if you are talking to your kid and what they want and their friends want, so that you're making sure that you're creating experiences that they actually want to go to instead of what you think that they want.
Absolutely. A question from the registration. How do you specifically help teens or adolescents with disabilities, maybe like autism, navigate social media? So a more specific population.
I think that's, again, where that conversation piece is really critical, and also where more scaffolded restrictions can be helpful, just because sometimes children with disabilities and teens with disabilities, they need a little bit more practice, right? So it's harder to kind of, if you are have autism and you are really, really interested in this one thing, it might be a little bit harder for yourself to regulate when to leave that space, right? When to exit a video game, or when to stop watching YouTube videos about something that you really love. So that's where, it might be better to more frequently come back to some of these rules, but set more restrictions in the beginning. So, for a neurotypical teen, you might have a time period of an hour, and then in 6 months you revisit that. But maybe if you know that your child with autism has a little more difficult time like regulating themselves on their screen, starting at 30 minutes, but you're coming back to that restriction in 3 months instead of 6 months. So it's just more steps to hopefully get to the same point.
Great. And one attendee is thinking about parental control, but as I'm sure a lot of people can relate, their child has their own device and sets up their own password. So how do you kind of balance that and set up that parental control?
Yeah, I think that's one of those things where like we love to talk about if you can like set it up, but once the cat's out of the bag, it's kind of hard. So even if they have their own devices, if you have a similar device, if it's like an iPad or an Apple device, there is like a family account, and you can link those devices at any point. And that might be a scenario where you have to get that password because you're setting up. It's not like you're necessarily taking away any of like their device or their ownership of it, but you're just linking it to your account, and then you can kind of build up those restrictions. So I know that Apple has that. Most places now do have some sort of family so that they can have all of their own settings in terms of like privacy access, but some of the larger, controls when it comes to screen time and stuff can come from like your device, not theirs.
All right. Another question from the registration. So talking a little bit about video games, which I know you discussed, but a high school son, he plays video games with a lot of, his friends, and his interactions with them are infested with negative energy. What do you suggest?
Yeah, I think I didn't necessarily talk about it here because we could have a whole conversation about it, but the gamer culture has for a long time been infused with some of that. And sometimes it's difficult to know like what is that culture and what is really problematic. So there's a lot of sarcasm, and there's a lot of like kind of critiquing each other, or even like making fun of each other on video games. But when does it become hurtful? And so that's where I think coming from to this conversation, if you want to talk to your child about it, coming from this conversation, instead of starting the conversation with, I don't want you to play this game anymore because I hate the way that you're talking to each other, which you might hate the way they're talking to each other. And that's kind of your gut reaction, is to like wrap them around and protect them from that. But get them thinking about what that means. Like, are you comfortable with the way your friends are talking, or do you wish that they weren't? And just kind of getting that thought in their head. And then you can see, you know, are you still hearing this kind of language? Maybe we have to have another conversation and lock that down for a little while, or like, are these even people that you want to be hanging out with? So instead of coming at it from like a punitive standpoint, where now they might take that underground and, you know, now they're playing games where they know at times you can't hear them or things like that, coming at it as a, hey, are you okay with the way that you're behaving? Michael Rich, the director of the lab, always likes to talk about the grandma rule, is like, would you want your grandma hearing what you're saying? And like, are you comfortable with this? So, you know, getting them to think about what that means for their behavior and their friends' behavior. And then, you know, coming back to it if it's not changing.
Thank you. And then thinking about time allowances. So are there appropriate time allowances for electronics? Thinking about maybe like an iPad, a PlayStation. Does anyone suggest or set limits that
Yeah,
parents can follow?
they are really individualized. Even the Academy of Pediatrics, so they have limits for the youngest children, like I said, like 18 months and below, and for, you know, toddlers, still that kind of 1 hour of screen time. But after that, they've actually revised recently and said it's a very personal decision, and it's more based on like the content. So I would say, instead of thinking about limits for devices, thinking about limits for content. So I saw in the question, like one of them was an Oculus. Okay, what are they using it for versus their iPad? So if they're using the Oculus, that's all the only things that they have on there are entertainment games. That's also a very, very immersive thing that we might want to limit a little bit more than say, you know, the iPad that they have their books on, or they're listening to audiobooks, right? So it's really more about what they're using the device for than kind of a blanket 1 hour for each item. So it might change depending on the device, but it's definitely more about like, what is that device used for than what is, you know, all of their devices combined.
Right. And I guess a follow-up question to that, are there specific television shows or apps specifically for middle school, 8 to 12 years old, that is recommended in the research for more like digital wellness, but also educational?
Yeah, so I think for like middle childhood is a difficult age, right? Because that's where a lot of these shows that are, you know, developmentally like created, or by that I mean like they have people and researchers on the team who are working to make sure that they really support healthy development. Those aren't appealing to them anymore. Like they like silly stuff. This is where I think the video gaming piece can be really powerful. And that's where I think there are a lot of games that are appealing to kids at this age, but ensuring that you're checking it out first to see like, is there a lot of violence? Is it social? Is it teaching some of these like kind of pro-social skills? And what is the benefit of them having it socially, even outside of that, right? So we think about, I think Minecraft is really, really popular, and it really spans like such a social landscape. I mean, there was a movie that came out, and kids are watching YouTube videos and learning how to like do things and build things. So that's one of those things where you think, okay, these are really popular games. How can they be leveraged to best support, right? We wouldn't want to let a kid just like have all the time that they want on Minecraft, but maybe every week you set a new challenge. And so you watch a YouTube video together, and this is how somebody built a house. And okay, at the end of the week, I want to see the house you built, right? So it's engaging in this game that's really popular, but also supporting those critical thinking skills of like problem solving and trying something and probably failing, but it's a really low stakes environment to practice that. So again, it's more of like, how do we use this thing that might be popular for kids this age? And, you know, maybe some of the time he's just running around killing zombies, but I have this challenge that I know he really wants to beat me at. So I know that that's like a really positive thing for him. As an example.
That's awesome. All right, so trying some ways to stop kids from playing games so they are not successful. So they have tried to disconnect the internet, but the kids are, resourceful and play offline. So any suggestions for this parent?
Yeah, I would also ask like if it's negatively affecting them, and if there's a way to integrate it into life. So maybe that means like you disconnect the internet and you play that game together. That is one of those scenarios where like we hear from kids that when it's taken away, it just makes them want to do it more. And I'm sure like we all had things that our parents said we can't do, and we try and find ways around it. So you can also like make it a little uncool, right? If you start doing it and you're like really excited to play with them, maybe they don't want to play it so much anymore, or maybe you learn that it's something you all like to do together. But I would say that kind of like pulling the plug can sometimes make it this kind of forbidden thing that kids just, now they know that they're not supposed to, so that's really appealing to a kid, and it is counterintuitive to us because we think, okay, that means it's bad for you, obviously you should stop doing it. But to kids like that, they're trying to push the boundaries, and screen time is often a place where they know they can do that.
Great. So zooming out a little bit, are there any evidence-based strategies for communities to better support positive media use? So in your research, thinking about like community interventions?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit, but like having space for teens, super important, for them to connect and have safe and healthy experiences together. Also just making sure that kids of all ages, whenever possible, obviously again, like, preschoolers aren't going to be involved in these conversations, but teenagers definitely should be when it comes to things like phone policies or home rules or community spaces. So get teens involved. If adults keep making decisions for teenagers and don't think about what they want, we're not going to be successful. So again, if we have a community event for teenagers, but it's focused on something that teenagers aren't interested in, they're not going to come, and it's not going to be successful, versus something that's like run by and geared towards teenagers. We have a student advisory council, and we have learned so much from them, and it's really driven our own research to be more proactive and powerful and focus on things that teens are interested in. We also just did a survey on phones and phone policies, and a lot of teenagers said that they were not included at all in the conversations around these. And sometimes those same kids are more likely to say that they think their phone restrictions are, unacceptable or don't really do anything. So, they might not have said, and you can still have phone restriction in schools, that's obviously a big conversation right now, but involve teenagers in the development of those policies so that what works, what doesn't, what's gonna, teenagers are gonna be honest and say they're gonna get around that. Like, that's not gonna stop anybody from, using XYZ. And what are the incentives and what can actually help? So I think, when we think about community spaces for teenagers and including them in these conversations are really critical and really support healthy development and media use.
Thank you. How can parents effectively manage daily Duolingo use for kids age 7 to 9 while keeping overall screen time healthy and balanced?
Yeah, that's one of those things where like it's an app where you're learning something, right? So it feels like, okay, I really want to allow them to do that. But thinking about the same way we would think about screen time that maybe isn't so healthy is like, where's the saturation point? So, you know, for young children, I think 7 to 9 was that, sorry, it went away.
Yeah.
Yes,
7 to
7
9.
to 9. You know, their attention spans are not that long. So at what point is the Duolingo just a game that they're kind of trying to get through? And thinking about that in terms of, you know, yes, it's educational media, but it still should be monitored because, you know, their attention span is probably like 15, 20 minutes doing Duolingo. So beyond that, it doesn't really carry a benefit anymore. So that's how we can kind of fit it into that. So even if it's educational, at what point is it not building on anything? Like I could do math problems for 45 minutes, but at 15 minutes, I really stopped learning anything new. So in terms of educational media, that's probably thinking about their attention spans is more helpful there to think about, you know, to kind of translate what they're learning.
Right, and I think our last question, and I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to, but I know Caitlin, you said you'd share your contact information, but you know, if they liked what they learned, where do they go? How do they get some more resources? Are there book recommendations? I guess what are the next steps?
Yeah, so the Digital Wellness Lab has a website, shameless plug, because I write a lot of the stuff on there. We have a family digital wellness guide, which I think is really great because it is separated by developmental stage. So we've taken like preschool and then middle childhood, tweens and teens, and we've talked about what they are, you know, where they're at developmentally, what's really important, that social building, that independence, how they're using media at this age, and then broken it into topics like how to talk to somebody about AI, or thinking about like if a child sees pornography online, and given those concrete examples of things that might be happening at these different ages and stages, to have that conversation. So I think that's like the first stop. Michael Rich does have a book. I would also really recommend the book Technology's Child by Katie Davis. It's really wonderful. It's also kind of developmentally separated as well, and talks about, you know, I think it's very balanced. It talks about like the positives, but also the risk factors and how we can ensure. And at the end of each chapter, there's kind of suggestions for parents and educators and even designers of these platforms. So those are some. So I would say Digital Wellness Lab, the Family Digital Wellness Guide is the first stop. Michael Rich's book, which is called The Mediatrician's Guide, and then Technology's Child.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. I know Sarah and I were really excited to have this community, you know, opportunity to talk about this topic. And I think we've learned so much, and there's just so much out there to continue to learn.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for.
I just
sitting.
want to mention that we did record today's webinar, and so we will be able to share this out. So those of you who are here who might want to share the information with somebody else, we haven't completely figured out where we're posting this yet, but Northborough Health and Human Services and Southborough Youth and Family are in all likelihood going to be sharing this webinar out through our respective platforms that we advertise on. And just keep your eyes out for that. And you know, if you don't see it and you're interested in viewing it, just reach out to either department and we'll make sure we get it to you. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a good night.